Welcome, everyone. This is Sarah Weir. I'm the Vice President of Advocacy and Affiliate Relations for the National Down Syndrome Society. I'm joined by my colleague, Madeline Will, who's our Vice President of Public Policy at NDSS. And our other two speakers are Maureen Gallagher, who's the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Down Syndrome Congress, and MDSC's Advocacy Specialist, John Anton. And they're going to cover the work that they've done in Massachusetts to pass a prenatal testing information bill in their state, which was modeled off of the federal Prenatally and Postnatally Diagnosed Conditions Act that NDSS and our affiliates and advocates helped pass through the federal system or through the U.S. Congress in 2008. So with that, I will stop here, and why don't I turn it over to Madeline Will to give you a little history and a little background on how we passed this legislation in 2008. Madeline?
Yes, thank you, Sarah. Hi, everyone. We're so pleased that you were able to make the time to participate in our webinar, and I'm going to talk about the federal legislation. So next slide. I want to talk about the history and give you a little bit of the background so you have a context for understanding the federal legislation, and then understanding how the piece that Maureen and John are going to speak about relates to the federal legislation. Well, it began with a hearing on prenatal diagnosis that was held in the Senate in November of 2004. Senator Brownback and a number of other individuals were involved, and I'll talk some more about that in a moment. We also had, at the same time that work was going on to develop legislation, the important release of a practice bulletin by the American Congress of Gynecologists and Obstetricians that recommended that all pregnant women be offered prenatal diagnosis. So now let's just talk about how the legislation unfolded and was ultimately passed. Next slide. There's an organization in Washington called the American Association for People with Disabilities. It is our version of the American Association for Retired Persons. And it has slowly been building its membership, and it is an impressive organization. On the board of that organization was a woman named Cheryl Sensenbrenner, who happened to be married to Congressman Sensenbrenner. Cheryl has a disability and is also a sibling of a woman with Down syndrome, and she had a great interest in the issue of prenatal diagnosis. She testified at the hearing that Senator Brownback organized, and she wanted to stress a few points, which I have bulleted here. She said that parents were being asked to consent to test without having accurate information about the test and without understanding the reality of raising a child with Down syndrome in our time, as opposed to having information that was 100 or 50 years old, and also that parents were not getting information about community resources that were available to families that had a child with a disability. Dr. Brian Chacon also testified at the hearing. He's familiar to many of you. He's the medical director of the Adult Down Syndrome Center of Advocate Lutheran General Hospital. Brian's point was that there was practically no data available on prenatal counseling or the kind of information that was being presented to parents. The hearing took place in November, and the following spring, I believe it was spring, the ACOG released its practice bulletin, which recommended that all pregnant women be offered. NDSS immediately responded by emphasizing the importance of accurate information, and that is a point that we have held on to and been consistent about since really 2004. NDSS also met with parents to gather information about the experiences that parents had had in terms of prenatal and postnatal diagnoses. And NDSS also was awarded a grant by the Kennedy Foundation to put together a distinguished group of advisors who would help develop accurate information. Next slide. After the hearing and after the ACOG announcement, a bill was introduced, but it was a rather flawed bill. And while there were efforts underway to try to improve the legislation, we then received a call from Mrs. Shriver, who was the head of the Joseph P. Kennedy Foundation, who indicated how interested she and her family and the foundation were in this issue and the legislation, and could there be a meeting between herself and Senator Brownback. That meeting was organized and arranged, and it led to Senator Kennedy becoming a co-sponsor of the legislation. The bill introduced by Senator Brownback was not bipartisan, and it would have been very difficult to move it through the House and the Senate without bipartisan support. So Senator Kennedy participating as a co-sponsor was a tremendous victory in development. The staff of both senators negotiated a new piece of legislation, a new version of it. It was introduced, and that finalized bill began its passage in 2007 on the Senate side. At the same time, there were attempts to try to get people in the House to support legislation, and we were able to identify several members of Congress. Kathy McMorris Rogers, I think many of you know her. She is a parent of a child with Down syndrome. She is from Washington State. Pete Sessions, who's from Texas, who's also a parent, and Patrick Kennedy, who was then in the House of Representatives, and Congressman Sensenbrenner. So the House bill was beginning to move, the Senate bill was beginning to move, and NDSS was working very hard behind the scenes to try to get as much support for the legislation as possible. And one of the things that we did, and Sarah helped in this, was to get a meeting with both pro-choice organizations and pro-life organizations to have an opportunity to explain to them what the bill was about, and that its chief purpose was to ensure that women who got a prenatal and a postnatal diagnosis received accurate information. Next slide. So what the law passed in September of 2008, and here's what it does. It provides for accurate, up-to-date information to pregnant women and physicians. It provides accurate, up-to-date information to women who get a postnatal diagnosis. That was one of the issues that was very important to Senator Kennedy, that the bill not only be focused on women who got a prenatal diagnosis, but also on women, couples, families that received a postnatal diagnosis. The bill calls for the referral of women who get a prenatal, postnatal diagnosis to community resources, and it also calls for the development and distribution of accurate information. So that is a summary of the steps in the legislation, and I will turn back to, Sarah, I guess, is going to turn over to Maureen and John.
Great. Thank you, Madeline. I think we wanted to give you this historical perspective about the federal legislation, and typically federal legislation is modeled at the state level, and so the next story and example that we want to share with you is what the Massachusetts Down Syndrome Congress and their advocacy efforts recently did in June and July of this year. So with that, I'll turn it over to Maureen and John.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Madeline. Well, it's really been a very inspiring 2 years for the MDSC as our organization had the opportunity and the drive to introduce our very first piece of legislation. So, you know, as we have become a larger, more sophisticated organization, we have realized that one of the most important things that we can do as an advocacy group and as a group that supports families who have children with Down syndrome and self-advocates with Down syndrome is that we really want to make sure that not only do we have programs and services, but that there are laws in place that support you know, the work that we do and looks into the future of what we need for the Down syndrome community. So this was a wonderful opportunity for us to introduce our first piece of legislation, and we'd like to start with the next slide, and John Anton will kind of walk you through kind of the very first important step that we took as an organization.
We identified the lead champion of our State House. Representative Thompson Candro is a staunch disability advocate, a father of a son with Down syndrome, was approached to sponsor the bill for us. He accepted the challenge and engaged his legal team to help us craft the legislation. He filed the bill in the Mass Legislature in the beginning of our 2-year legislative session in January of 2011. He personally worked with us to keep us informed about the bill throughout the 2 years, helping us to navigate the political process.
Thank you, John. Let's go to the next slide. So in a similar way that Madeline talked about identifying a champion and working closely with some lead sponsors of the bill, that was a very important first step for us to take as well. And we're very fortunate to have a representative in the Massachusetts legislature that we could go to talk about what our ideas were around this bill. And he was a phenomenal champion, really helped us every step of the way, beginning with crafting the legislation. So you can see on this slide, this is the actual verbiage of the law that was passed in Massachusetts, and I thought for people on the call from other states, you might want to see what this looks like so that you can perhaps use this as a guide in drafting your own similar legislation in your state. But basically, it started out with the name ENACT relative to Down syndrome genetic test results, and it was interesting. Things can sometimes change throughout the legislative process, and the final name actually changed in the toolkit. You'll see on the NDSS website that there's actually the final law and the new name, but this is kind of where we started, and it's throughout the process. It didn't change significantly from this initial drafting, but Tom's legal team had to find out within the Massachusetts general laws, you know, where this bill would fit. So you can see in the beginning of the law describes Chapter 111 of the general laws of Massachusetts, which is where this would fit into our laws. It defined the term Down syndrome, and it also defined the people that this particular legislation referred to. I think it's very similar to the federal legislation. It talks about making up-to-date evidence-based written information about Down syndrome that has been reviewed by medical experts in the National Down Syndrome organizations. It talks about the fact that the written information needs to provide, physical developmental education and psychosocial outcomes, as well as some other things. And it talks about, in addition to information, it also has to provide resources, such as how families can get in touch with first call programs and support services, or have access to hotlines or other resources and clearinghouses on a national and a local level. It's important for us to have Massachusetts Down Syndrome Congress in the legislation because we wanted to make sure that families who do get a diagnosis prenatally or postnatally in Massachusetts, they can come to us for support. The one thing that you probably would like to know about the MDSC is that we do have a very strong first call program, and we do have some parents specifically trained to work with families after they receive a prenatal diagnosis. So we match up families who call us with other families who've had a similar experience but are just further along in where they are as a parent. Next slide. So we learned a lot along the way, and I think it was very exciting, enlightening, challenging. But I know for us initially it seemed a little intimidating, but having champions like Tom Sanacondro and the help of others, we really learned to navigate the process over the course of 2 years. And I'm hoping that what we learn, will benefit you all as you consider doing something like this in your state. We had a lead group at the MDSC, myself as the executive director, our family support director, Sarah Cullen, who runs our first call program, a physician, our MDSC legislative task force, and also about a third of the way into our advocacy for the bill, we were able to hire an outside legislative consultant also to lend some support in our advocacy efforts. It was really helpful working with the NDSS. We're very fortunate to have the NDSS and their policy center in Washington, D.C., and they've really guided us, particularly initially in terms of crafting the bill and developing our strategy around it. And what we learned from them, and that we found subsequently was actually a significant part in our success, was that we didn't attract controversy about the bill in either the pro-life or the pro-choice movement. So we actually did a lot of advocacy behind the scenes, meeting with people personally, bringing constituents in to meet with legislators. We talked overall about the emergence of new prenatal blood tests and the implications for our membership, but we didn't spread the news about the bill to the media and things like that because we didn't want to kill the bill through, pro-choice or pro-life attaching themselves to it. So we positioned ourselves exactly the way the NDSS, we positioned it as a pro-information bill, meaning that we wanted every couple who received a prenatal or postnatal diagnosis to have access to accurate, up-to-date information and supports. And we had to reiterate that over and over and over again through all of our meetings with people at the State House. And the other thing that we really stressed was the urgency of the bill. And as many of you probably know, it can take a long time to get a bill passed. It's a daunting task, but we knew the urgency of this bill because when we started, we knew the prenatal tests were being developed, and then about halfway through the cycle, the actual tests, were released. So we were able to stress this urgency, and I think that that helped us to get it passed within the session that was introduced for the first time. So that was exciting, and I think one of the reasons why that happened. Next slide. One of the other important parts of our advocacy was having a credible prenatal booklet that we could bring to our meetings to show that we weren't just a Down syndrome group trying to disseminate propaganda, that we had a prenatal booklet, Understanding a Down Syndrome Diagnosis, that was, approved by national Down syndrome organizations, medical interest groups, and others. So it had been looked over with a very tight microscope and approved by a broad range of people. So that was very important to show the legislators that had questions and doubts about the bill. And the other thing is having a credible physician. We were very fortunate to have Dr. Brian Scottfield come to many of our meetings, and he could answer the medical-related information, and again, come from the medical perspective, not just the Down syndrome community perspective, and that really helped us immensely. Next slide. So overall, I think one of the key themes was just developing relationships. We didn't always know who the champions would be, but they were kind of unveiled throughout the process. When we had our very first hearing with the Committee on Public Health, one of the state senators shared that she had had a false positive prenatal diagnosis. And once we found that out, we went to her and found out she was very much in favor of the legislation. And she was a key senator that had a really good relationship with the Senate President, so that was very effective. We found that we had family members who worked in the Senate President's office, in the State Treasurer's office, and those family members were able to kind of from the inside help us set up meetings, come to meetings, and really, again, emphasize the importance of the bill. So I think, these are the different groups that we worked with, the State House leaders, government agency leaders. We were proactive in thinking, well, who will be interested in this bill? If it gets implemented, who will it affect? Who will want to know about it? Who might potentially challenge the bill and keep it from getting passed? So we were proactive. We met with the Department of Public Health. We met with the Department of Developmental Services. And it ended up the Department of Public Health was the lead agency that would actually help in implementing the bill. So if they had said, no, we're not in favor of it, then it could have prevented it from moving forward. But we met with them several times, and they ended up supporting what we were trying to accomplish. And our local DD Council, they actually adopted it as one of their priority bills. So they helped testify for the bill, and again, lent some credibility to the bill coming from a broader range of groups. So anyway, that was very important to our success. Next slide. And now John will talk a little bit about the bill's journey and tell you kind of what the process was that the bill had to go through. So John, go right ahead.
Okay, our bill's journey, the bill is filed by our sponsor. The hearing is held by the Committee on Public Health to testify. The bill is voted out favorably. The bill goes to the Health Care Finance Committee, is modified and voted out favorably. The bill goes to the House Ways and Means, where it is voted out favorably. The bill goes to the Committee on Third Reading and is scheduled for the vote in the House chambers. The bill is passed by the House and sent to the Senate. The bill is passed in the Senate and sent to the House for enactment. The bill is sent to the governor for approval, and the governor approves the bill and signs it into law.
Thank you, John. So that sort of gives you an overview of all the different steps that our bill had to take in order to finally be signed into law, and there were some, struggles along the way getting it out of various committees. And again, having the relationships and having key people who could tell us what the problems were or who might have been against the bill that we needed to make appointments with was very important. Next slide. So just a few tips from our experience. Always look ahead to the next step in your bill so that you have relationships with people who will be key decision makers moving forward. Identifying family members who can be influential with key leaders was so very important, and I talked a little bit about that previously. Be prepared for legislative meetings. Know what your talking points are. Bringing your materials. Having 3 or 4 people who can, be there to talk about various aspects. So bringing a medical person and having a family member of or a constituent of whoever that legislator is, and other advocates that need to be in the room for all of those meetings is so important. And then follow up after each meeting. It's always a best practice to show appreciation for the support that you're gaining from the legislators. Provide them additional information that they might need. Some people wanted more information. We had to get back to them. And although we didn't directly work with the media in our publications, talk about the bill, we talked about the issues surrounding the bill, about the prenatal test and the implications for people with Down syndrome in the future. And so we were able to feature photos of the legislators that we met with so that they get some publicity and some support around working with us. I talked already about, I think, the issue about not creating controversy about the bill. And then finally, we found that several things were helpful that also require financial resources. We purchased a tracking tool called InstaTrack, which is a tool, an online tool that can help you track all the State House activities. And as we got through the process and realized, we needed to know when things were voted out of a committee or whatever, we wanted to make sure that we could respond quickly to things, and that service ended up being very helpful. And then again, the professional lobbyist that we hired, a donor underwrote the cost, and she lent a tremendous amount of credibility to our meetings, was able to help us build relationships, and add another whole level of advocacy and support for our efforts. And I think the last slide is just really a celebration of our special day at the State House with Governor Deval Patrick and some of our families and children. John was there. He's not shown in this picture, but we had about 20 people there for the bill signing, and it was just an incredible day. And now we're moving on to implementation of the bill. We have a meeting coming up in a few weeks with the Department of Public Health to ensure that now that we have the law, that it's fully implemented. So it's been very exciting.
Thanks, Maureen. That was
You're
a
welcome.
great overview of everything that you have done. You guys have done an exceptional job at moving this forward in Massachusetts, and I think we look forward to working with you all on the implementation phase to see how everything goes. Before I move on, Maureen, did you guys have funding attached to the bill that was included, that was passed earlier this year?
We talked about having like $10,000 attached for the bill to pay for the prenatal booklets, but it ended up not having any funding attached to it. But through all of our advocacy efforts, we were able to get the chairman of House Ways and Means to add the MDSC in the state budget. So for the last 8 months of our advocacy for the actual bill, we were simultaneously advocating for a line item in the state budget for the MDSC, which is a different process and also a very important one. And we were successful in getting $100,000 allocated in the state budget, and that was approved the end of June, beginning of July, when the state budget was finalized. Maybe it was the middle of July. So now we have the bill, and now we have some additional funding that we'll be able to put towards implementing the bill and working with DPH. So we're really excited about that. But if you can get money attached to the appropriations, obviously that would be ideal.
Sarah, do you want to take a minute? And there are quite a few questions that might be focused on that Maureen could answer. Do you want to go ahead and ask those questions now? Like me to have those do that, take a break, and then, or would you like to move on and do all of those at the end?
Let's go ahead and address those questions now, and then we can get to the toolkit rollout.
Okay, great. All right, so the first question is, how do you convince legislators a law is needed if professional guidelines already require providing balancing information and the Kennedy-Brownback law recognizing balancing info and referral to support groups should be provided?
So let me see if I understand that question. Is that asking why you need a state bill if you already have a federal bill?
Yeah, how do you convince them it's needed at the state level?
Well, you know, it's interesting. We didn't get a lot of pushback on that at all. You know, we really focused on Massachusetts being a state that prides itself in being proactive and ahead of the game. And we pushed the urgency of the prenatal tests that were being developed and then afterwards that had been released. So we didn't emphasize the Kennedy-Brownback bill in our conversations, so perhaps that's why there weren't questions about that, but perhaps Madeline might have, or Sarah may have an answer to that.
Well, I think not that your strategy was a good one. There was no need to talk about the Kennedy-Brownback legislation. And by the way, the Kennedy-Brownback legislation was not and has not to this day been appropriated. So even though we have these good guidelines, it is still tough going getting the information developed and circulated and sent to physicians and to women who get a prenatal diagnosis.
You know, and I think we really emphasize that the MDSC is a statewide organization, that we have a first call program, and I think if we did get that question, we would probably say that we think that, you know, the local Down syndrome organization working in partnership with the, you know, the state agency is probably more effective and more likely to ensure that all physicians and medical providers as well as families who are getting the diagnosis, you know, there's more control there. So I think if we had gotten the question, we probably could have made a case for that. But that would be a you know, a good thing maybe we could develop as, you know, questions that you might have and how you might answer them.
Right, good deal. Okay, and then attendee is curious, not to be rude, but they would like to know how much did the legislative consultant cost, and was he worth it, and why?
Well, it's interesting. It's expensive. Madeline will probably tell you has a lot more experience in this than I do. But we got a $24,000 donation to cover the cost, and it didn't fully cover the cost of the consultant, and she liked us so much, and we liked her so much, she actually did a lot of pro bono work for us. But I have to tell you, we're going to hire her back this year. We liked her so much, and we thought that it was added that much clout kind of to our organization to have that lobbying entity behind us. So I think it was well worth it if you have a budget and you can allocate some funds, or if you have a donor like we did who was willing to, you know, underwrite the cost. It was highly valuable in my opinion.
All right. How much of a grassroots effort was used to lobby legislators in terms of numbers? Who oversaw that process of recruiting grassroots advocates to contact their legislators? And I think we may have already answered this question, but I think it probably would be good for you to reiterate, you know, that you didn't really do a grassroots effort.
Yeah, what we did is when we were going to meet with, say, the chair of the House Ways and Means, we'd look in our database. We have a database of all our members. We have a database of about 10,000 people, of which about 3,500 are actually MDSC members. So we sorted it by town and in geography so we could see who was in their district. And so mainly I did that with my team at the MDSC. And then I outreached to those constituents and then invited them to come to meetings or asked them to make phone calls. So it was a very personalized approach.
And then how much did you get the governor's office involved in the bill passage, if at all?
You know, we talked about meeting with the governor, but we were so busy meeting with everybody else that we didn't actually reach out to the governor's office until the last few months of the process. Because, you know, we wanted to make sure that he signed it if it came. But we didn't work closely with the governor's office. But if we had had an in there, we probably would have. But I think, you know, the way it worked for us is that we kind of worked with our champions where we had an in, which was the Senate President's office, particularly. who was a big champion for us. So, and we had a really good relationship with the chair of House Ways and Means. So we had some influence on the House and the Senate side, and we kind of worked those pretty significantly, and then the governor's office eventually, but we didn't have a primary contact at the governor's office. But if you do, I'm sure that would also be a good strategy.
Thanks, Maureen. I'm going to hand it back over. I think some of the other questions may be covered, or that they would be related to the next part of the presentation. So I'm going to hand it back over to Sarah.
Great. Thanks, Gina. Those are excellent questions. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can take what we've done at the federal level and then what MDSC has done at the state level and work with you all to do something similar in your state. So next slide, please. What we've done at NDSC is, NDSS with MDSC is take the model legislation that the Massachusetts Down Syndrome Congress passed and put that up on our website as a potential tool that you all can take forward. And so this is here hyperlinked on the slide, but it's also available on our website. And if you go on to the next slide, I won't go into the specifics because I think Maureen did a great job of giving you really the nuts and bolts of what the law entails and how it's similar to the federal bill and what they've done at the state level. So I really want to talk about how we at NDSS can help you move forward along this process. At NDSS, we have a comprehensive advocacy program, and two of those programs that I want to mention is one, our NDSS Government Affairs Committee program. This is our program that focuses on networking Down syndrome affiliates in your particular state. We do a 2-day leadership training conference where folks from the Policy Center come out to your state, and we work with affiliates from across the state to get as much representation as possible at the leadership training conference to teach you all how to be effective advocates. We just launched, I believe, our 16th Government Affairs Committee in Louisiana, and I know there's quite a few folks from Louisiana participating in today's webinar. But this is a great way to build a coalition around a specific policy issue or policy priority at the state level. So I just definitely want to make you aware of this particular program as a vehicle to advancing legislation, not only on prenatal testing information legislation, but also in other areas. The GACs come together and work on policy issues that they agree on as a network, and we support them in technical assistance and conference calls, legislation drafting, and the list could go on and on, but we're very plugged into what's going on at the state level. We also work with the leadership of the government affairs committees to make sure that the states are talking to one another about what's going on in their particular state. So we traditionally hold conference calls with our government affairs committee co-chairs that represent the leadership of the GAC so that they can talk to one another and model off of what's going on in a particular state and best practices. The other program I just wanted to mention briefly, although it has more of a federal focus, they help support the federal NDSS legislative agenda here in Washington, is the NDSS Down Syndrome Ambassador Program. And this is a program that we launched in July, and we currently have at least one ambassador from every state. And their job is really to help focus on building relationships with members of Congress and their staff to advance federal efforts. Although it's focused on the federal level, a lot of these folks in your particular states have an interest in public policy and advocacy. So if you are, in fact, interested and don't have a particular GAC in your state, we can plug you in with Ambassador and get you all moving forward. So that way, if you don't have a GAC, you can still move forward and hopefully take on what Maureen and her team have done in Massachusetts and move it along in your state. Just some other areas that we can help provide assistance to you is in the area of technical assistance to our affiliates and local Down syndrome organizations. We can help you, Madeline and I do this on a daily basis, with political strategy. we can help you identify those champions, analyze the committee structure in your particular state, and then most importantly, which I think John and Maureen did a great job of pointing out in their presentation, is building relationships with those particular legislators in your particular state. Relationships and anything in politics is key to moving things forward. So we can help you identify those folks, and we might have relationships in a particular state that we can also, introduce you and allow you to move that forward. We can help you with bill drafting. We have the model legislation that Massachusetts has done, but sometimes that particular draft or that particular legislation needs to be refined or edited and negotiated, so we can definitely help you there. And then finally, on advocacy materials development, we are very experienced when it comes to action alerts, press releases, one-pagers, things of that nature that you need to make your efforts known in a particular state, and recruit folks from your Down syndrome organizations to get involved in advocacy at the grassroots level. We need to educate them and make them aware of the particular issues, so we can definitely help you there. And then finally, again, Maureen did a great job of pointing this out, but we can help you develop and establish a coalition in your state. If you're not one of our 16 GAC states, that's all right. We can help you network with the other Down syndrome organizations in your particular state and other organizations that exist in your state that have a particular focus on disability. We can plug you into those organizations and help you develop a coalition to move your particular bill forward. Next slide, please. So on our website, again, this is hyperlinked. We've created a toolkit of all the materials that MDSC has created along the way. We have the sample prenatal testing information model legislation up there and hyperlinked. We have the sample press release that Maureen and her team did that announced their legislation being enacted and signed by the governor. Again, these are just one of many examples. We can help you create tools that are customizable to your state. And then Maureen did a great job of pointing out the testimony that helps build the case at the state level. Madeline also highlighted the testimony that that was introduced and provided at the federal level. We should probably also include that up there as well. But these are examples of great testimony that were given before the state legislature in Boston or in Massachusetts that you can pull from and, again, help build that argument for the need for legislation. Next slide. Oh, and thanks, Dina. Dina's hyperlinking the website there for us. But if you don't have the hyperlink, we'll make sure and send the URL out. That way everybody on the call has that link and that information. Before we take questions, I know that John, Maureen, Madeline, and myself are available to answer any questions that you have. We're just an email away, so please don't hesitate to contact us. I know we want to be a resource to you all moving forward, and we're very excited about this initiative and working with you and other states around the country to raise the awareness of prenatal testing and make sure that the accurate, most up-to-date information is provided to women and families. So I'll stop there. And Dina, do we want to facilitate some questions?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, I click on those to actually advance the slide, and then I get the hyperlink. So apologies there. But just a small note that one of our attendees said, let Madeline know how much they enjoyed her covering the history of Kennedy Brownback and emphasizing how the issue was framed. Even though they were involved with Kennedy Brownback, they didn't know all the history, which is very interesting. So thank you, Madeline, for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a question for Maureen. How did you overcome concerns that this effort would threaten your 501c3 status since you were engaged in lobbying?
Well, I actually had to become a registered lobbyist, which was a surprise to me. But it didn't affect our 501c3. I mean, we don't do that. I mean, we do advocacy as a part of what we do, but we don't do so much advocacy that it threatens our 501c3 status. But I did talk to Madeline at one point to help understand that a bit more, because obviously that's important. But it didn't. We were able to do this without any threat to our 501c3 because I was at the State House so much and lobbying all the time for this bill. I was told that to be on the safe side, I had to register. So I am now a registered lobbyist and have to do all the paperwork and all that. The nice thing is the lobbying firm that we worked with does it all for me, and I just have to provide the information, but they do all the filings for us. So that's made it kind of easy for us. But do you have more to add to that, Madeline or Sarah?
Well, there are people who believe that if you belong to a nonprofit, you can't lobby, and that's going to jeopardize your 501c3 status, and that really isn't accurate. It's a matter of how much time is spent in lobbying and how much money is spent in lobbying, and mostly nonprofits like ours really do not cross those thresholds. I would just make that, preface all of what Maureen just said by making that statement, so that it is, you can feel comfortable about taking an initiative of this sort and not be looking over your shoulder every moment, worried about whether or not you're going to be violating the Lobbying Act. And remember, in the reporting and in the way the law is written, Congress understands and the state legislatures understand that you may be very, very active for a particular period of months, but that if you look across the year, that the amount of time involved in lobbying on that particular issue is relatively small, especially as compared to the rest of the work of your organization, which isn't policy, which isn't a particular issue, prenatal legislation, and so forth.
And this is Sarah, I would just add that just because Maureen had to register to be a lobbyist in Massachusetts doesn't mean if you're in Oklahoma you might have to register. The requirements for state lobbying are all different, and they're subject to state law and regulations. At the federal level, there's very strict Lobbying Disclosure Act that was passed in 2008 that we have to adhere to. And both Madeline and I are registered lobbyists, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to register in your state. And we can help you find out that information and find out what you might need to do to file and go through that process.
Okay, the next question, and I do know the answer to this, but I think it's important that we kind of note it, is do you know how many other states have passed this type of legislation?
We thought we were the first state, but then we found out there were 2 other states before us, which is great. So that's my understanding, that there were 2 other states.
What are those states, Sarah?
I know that Missouri is one of them, and they actually had a member of the Missouri Senate who had a son with Down syndrome, and that spurred his interest in passing some legislation about, I think like 4 or 5 years ago. That bill, from what I understand, has been implemented very effectively, and there's been really no funding put behind it in the state of Missouri. So efforts there could definitely be improved. But I'm not sure what the other state is. Maybe, Maureen, you know.
Mark is telling us that it's Virginia.
Is it?
Yeah, that Mark is saying it's Virginia.
Okay, all right. I think Mark gave us the information. Hi, Mark.
So here's a great question. Although the Prenatally and Postnatally Diagnosed Awareness Act was intended to provide for accurate and up-to-date information, the federal funding to that course was not appropriated. How can organizations make sure state and federal oh, I lost my place. State or federal funding also follows the passage of this law. So I'm sure state funding follows the passage of the law.
Oh, you mean if a law is passed at the state level to make
yes.
sure
What are the options, or what are the things that they need to know to make sure, questions they need to ask to make sure that the funding follows the law?
Well, it's I guess I'll let Maureen answer that, but it's a separate process getting an appropriation, and it's another process that involves heavy lifting on the part of advocates. You have to do the same sorts of cultivating of relationships, trying to get champions, trying to articulate very clearly your purpose and the supporting arguments and data. But it's just another part of the process, and you obviously it's easy to say that you need an appropriation if this bill is going to be effectively implemented, because you need an infrastructure and you need a capacity within your state in order to ensure that women and physicians are getting prenatal information about Down syndrome when they get a prenatal diagnosis or a postnatal diagnosis. Maureen, what do you?
To keep the amount like minimal, so that it wouldn't, again, because of the economy and how hard it is for the state legislatures to approve anything that has money attached to it. So we originally looked at it about $10,000, which wasn't a lot, but that was our strategy, is to not ask for too much. But then that actually didn't end up getting approved with the bill. We ended up asking for a separate $100,000 earmark. So, I'd be curious what other people think about that process. But it's definitely another push to get money attached to things.
Now, here's a question for Sarah. How do I find out if my state is already one of the 16 GAC states?
That is a great question. If you go on to our NDSS.org website under the NDSS Government Affairs Committee, we have all of our GACs listed. And we'll also include that in the information that goes out with the materials following today's call. We'll include that link in the information.
And just to note that all the information that comes out of the to you guys, it will include a survey and all of this information. We'll get all this together and send it out to you. So we're really excited that but just take 2 minutes to complete the survey for us. Just a reminder that if you have a question, you'll need to type that into the question pane on the sidebar. And I see some hands raised, but I can't unmute you at this time. So if you'll just type that question in on that question pane, we'll be sure and ask it. Next question is, what was the timeline for passing the bill, Maureen? First meeting with your legislative champion to the final passage.
Well, we began to talk to our champion probably about 4 to 5 months before we actually introduced the bill at the beginning of our legislative session. So the whole process was about 2 years, from first, conceptual to talking to the champion to crafting the bill, introducing the bill, and then advocating and getting it passed. So it was a 2-year process all in all.
And the impact of the bill, a significant amount of investment of time and manpower. So what has been the impact you've seen so far?
Well, that still remains to be seen in terms of Massachusetts, because it was just passed at the end of June. Then over the summer there's a break. A lot of people go on break. So we're meeting with the Department of Public Health during the month of October, and we'll start to work with them to kind of carve out an implementation plan.
Any last questions Please type those into the question pane. I just want to take a moment to thank everyone for taking some time today to do this. John and Maureen, Sarah, Madeline, Beth. Okay, a quick comment. Another reason why state legislation is needed, even with Kennedy-Brownback, is that Kennedy-Brownback is only permissive. It is not shall language. Do you want to address that?
Yeah, that's true. Actually, what it says is that the grantees, there were to be funds that would be awarded to a consortium of organizations at the state level, disability groups, medical groups, public health agencies, etc., that would have come together to write a proposal. The bill says that the materials and information developed by those who receive the grants would be made available to physicians and to women who get a prenatal diagnosis. It's not language that says that physicians will distribute or will provide such and such information to women. The emphasis was on the grantees who were developing the information. What does your legislation say, Maureen? Do you have a shall?
You know, I'll have to reread it. It focuses on, you know, requiring the medical providers to make information available. But it actually, it's the Department of Public Health that actually has the biggest responsibility, I think, in our legislation, which I think is good because it is a state agency that now has this requirement to provide the information to physicians, who then in turn need to make it available to people who have received the prenatal diagnosis. But I'd have to look at the wording again to, you know, I think it's close to shall as that we could get, given how closely it was looked at. Well, there is a little pushback on the part of physicians not wanting to be required to do certain things, that they want to be able to do what's best for their patients. So, you know, I think the wording was also kept that in mind, that physicians do have some discretion.
It's a nice thing about having the slides on a piece of paper in front of me is that I can go back to that slide and look at your wording. But I also got a comment from Mark that says, yes, it's mandatory. It says all healthcare providers providing a pre- or postnatal diagnosis will provide materials from the department and referral to first call programs. So I don't even need to go to the slides because Mark is way ahead of me.
Oh, good. Thanks, Mark.
That's much stronger language than the federal legislation. We could not have gotten the bill passed. We couldn't have gotten a bipartisan bill with that kind of language. The emphasis and the onus for work was going to be on the agencies and the organizations at the state level that would be developing the materials, and they would make them available to physicians. It wasn't requiring the physicians to do anything, or even mandating that the grantees had to. It was that they would make available as less stern language than the pass or the must.
I didn't get I got an incomplete question here, but yes, and so we did get that. Yes, you have a shall, and so great. Any more questions quickly before we wrap this up? How was the letter case prenatal booklet used as a tool to help the advocacy of the bill, and do you think the new announcement that the copyright is held by the Kennedy Foundation and that the administration is being done by the University of Kentucky will help other affiliates with similar advocacy efforts?
I would think so. it really helped us tremendously to have the information, because people were leery on what families would actually receive, and knowing that there was something already developed by various groups, reassured them that, it wasn't going to be something outrageous that, that wasn't well thought out and approved by a number of different groups, including advocacy organizations and medical providers. So I think it was a terrific tool.
And the next question is that, the aspect of it not being a pro-life bill. Do you want to address that a little bit more so that I would love to do all this question at the end. I know people have to leave, but this is being recorded, so it's important that people can watch this later and get all of these questions.
Sure. Well, legislators feel very important. They look at all their constituents and all their constituents' viewpoints. And as you know, different legislators or different parties might feel one way or the other, pro-life or pro-choice. And if we sided with one or the other, we would automatically perhaps be eliminating the support of those that we really needed to get the bill passed. So we felt strongly as an organization that, we had to be a pro-information organization, that we weren't in the business of making choices for families, but we wanted to be sure that when people were making these difficult choices, particularly families who got the diagnosis prenatally, that they were making those decisions based on up-to-date, accurate information and supports, and not, I think Madeline said it earlier, based on old, outdated, stereotypical information. And, we've been talking amongst ourselves at the MDSC and saying, it's kind of ironic that these tests are now available at a time when the life expectancy, the potential for people with Down syndrome, it has never been better than it is now. But not everybody knows that like we know it. So we think connecting people with accurate, up-to-date information and resources is the best that we can do as an organization. And so that pro-information, I think, was critical in order to get the bill passed.
And who is the department?
I'd be curious for others to share what they think.
Sorry. Oh, who is the department labeled in the bill?
Ours was Department of Public Health.
All right. Okay. I think we're going to wrap it up. I don't think we have any more questions at this moment. So, but just a huge thank you to John Anton, to Maureen Gallagher, to Sarah Ware, to Madeline Will, and to Beth Finkelstein, too, for doing this today for us. So thank you all, and any last words from our presenters?
No, just thank you for joining us, and please reach out to us if we can be of any help.
Yep. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.